Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's a great pleasure to finally have this product done and be able to go out and talk about it. As Brett mentioned, we've been working on this project for since January. We started out having a series of roundtable conversations like this one with policymakers in DC, trying to identify some specific measurements that we're going to use to track poverty, to try and cut poverty over the next 10 years by 2020. And we started with several conversations, and as you can imagine, when you talk about cutting poverty in half, it seems like such a daunting process. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is to figure out how to simplify that process so that people don't think that it's something that we can't accomplish, because we can accomplish it. And if there's one takeaway today, I want folks to leave to understand that we've done this in the past, and we've done it several times in the past over the last 60 years or so. We've cut poverty significantly in this country, and so we can do it again with the right tools, right level of leadership, and the right amount of accountability for our policymakers. Before I jump into the data, I just want to give a quick backgrounder on half and 10 and how we got started, and then hopefully spend a good bit of my time today kind of walking through the fun part of this process, which is our innovative and kind of intuitive website that we've designed to help people use the data. It's a lot of data. I didn't bring any of the reports today because it's 120 pages, and trying to be green, we can go on the website and pull down chapters in smaller sections than the whole thing. So so half and 10 came about after a paper that the Center for American Progress put out back in 2007. That paper came about after Hurricane Katrina. CAP and a lot of policymakers in DC basically felt that we needed to do something more specific and targeted to address poverty in this country. And they put out a paper that kind of highlights some policy-specific things that they wanted the country to do. One of the takeaways in that document was that we would cut poverty in the U.S. by 26% if we did three things: increase the minimum wage, expand childcare so that all eligible families have access to childcare, and expand the earned income tax credit. Now, these are three simple ideas that would bring down the poverty rate by 26% at that point. This was using 2006 data. In the stimulus package, some of these things got changed. The earned income tax credit, for example, kept 3 million children out of poverty last year. 6 million people in total were kept out of poverty because of the earned income tax credit. So this is a powerful vehicle that we've utilized in the past to reduce poverty in this country, and we continue to push for expansion and improvements to that program. So basically with this paper, the Center for American Progress decided that they wanted to have like an action arm. We didn't want to just put out another document that sat on the shelf and all of that. And so they formed a partnership with the Coalition on Human Needs and the Leadership Conference in Civil and Human Rights to create a campaign to cut the U.S. poverty rate in half. We thought that the data that showed earned income tax credits and a number of other policy changes would be actualized if we were able to have a campaign that would do that over the decade. This is the framework of the campaign. This is basically what we've decided, and I try to find a clever graph to demonstrate what we were trying to do. I don't know if this is clever or not, but the idea here is that as you expand the outer smaller circles, the big circle, which is our poverty rate, would shrink. So we want to have more good jobs in the economy, and we define good jobs as jobs that pay a family-sustaining wage, jobs that offer benefits to employees, and jobs that can grow with an individual over time. The idea being that not everyone is going to find a good job when they first come into the workforce. Some people are going to have jobs that are transitional jobs that they want to grow from. But with the proper training and proper improvements in the labor market, an equitable labor market, all individuals would be able to find jobs over the course of their careers that would be able to sustain them and sustain their families. And of course, a lot of the poverty conversations center around strong families. And how do you create families that can, sustain themselves, take care of their children, build supporting environments in your communities where they're self-sustaining and self-reliant. And so a lot of the policies that we're pushing around childcare and tax credits for families are in that bucket around strong families. And then the last piece of our framework is around economic security for families. We know that poor people spend a lot more of their incomes on simple things that upper income families don't spend the same share of their income on. For example, if you go to a low income community in, I'll just pick a city that I'm familiar with, Baltimore, Maryland, for example, it costs a lot more to pay for a gallon of milk than it does in Fairfield County in Maryland, which is a more affluent community. We know that a lot more low income families face challenges with things like even doing their taxes, they pay a lot more for taxes. So we're trying to figure out how do we expand economic security for families as they move through the kind of spectrum from low income to higher income families. And that's a big piece of kind of like long-term stability and long-term economic security. That's kind of the backdrop of where half and 10's been since 2010. When the campaign first started in 2008, after the paper came out, we had this great goal, we had a major kickoff, and then right in the middle of that, the Great Recession started. And we've seen the poverty rates increase significantly between 2007 and 2010. We're now at 46.2 million people. It's increased over 9 million people since the campaign was first kind of envisioned. And we realized that it's a brand new day, and we're moving in a direction that we're not really wanting to go. And if we're going to cut poverty in half, we need to start figuring out a much more aggressive plan to do that. And so this idea came up of having a report that would track a number of specific policy things, but also measure our progress about how we're doing over time. This report provides an opportunity to give advocates at the local level and at the national level more specific tools about how to keep their policymakers engaged and keep the leadership moving in the right direction. Another key part of that also, though, is that the federal government for the first time in 2010 is coming out with a new set of data that will look at how families are doing in terms of economic hardship. Right now, the poverty level is basically a flat number. If you make more than $23,000 for a family of four, you're classified as being poor. We know that people who make slightly above the official poverty level also face a lot of challenges, and people cycle in and out of poverty, but they're not really captured, and there's no real kind of national strategy about how do we keep people from coming back once they've emerged from poverty. And so we wanted to expand on our framework to look at these issues and to figure out, how do we help people not just to climb out of poverty, but to kind of move along the spectrum of economic security. So these are some of the other piece of the new information that's coming out from the federal government is called a supplemental poverty measure, and this is something that, if you're interested in, I could talk to you in much more details about. I don't want to take up time to do that right now. But basically, the other key piece of it is that it shows how the country is doing in terms of federal programs that are designed to help low-income people. As you can see, under this measure, the poverty rate is 15.3%. But if you look down, if you take out the food stamp program, you see that the poverty rate would be 16.7%. It would be 17.2% without the earned income tax credit. This is important because a lot of the rhetoric that takes place in Washington, D.C. is that the federal government can't do anything to reduce poverty. And these numbers are showing that is not the fact. We would have a lot more people falling into poverty without these programs. And so as we push for expansions in these programs, it is to say that federal government is critically important and is needed to play an important role in driving down the poverty rate for low-income families. This is a chart that I put in. This chart, the Congressional Budget Office came out with a report, the same day that our report came out. And when you spend 9 months working on something and then CBO comes out with a report that basically says it all, and gets a lot of media, but it also reinforced. It's a good thing that it wasn't opposed to anything we were saying, which would have been a disaster. It basically reinforced our paper, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this chart because it's very simple and it gets to the point of what we're trying to get to. As you look at the Wall Street Occupy movement that's been taking place around the country, this is a demonstration of what's happening. Since 1979, we've seen the American workforce at its most, the American workforce has grown extremely well in terms of productivity. We are now much more efficient workforce. Much more people are graduating from high school and college than in previous decades. But at the same time, we do not see income growth, real income growth for families growing in all of these different quintiles. It stays relatively kind of, it increases at a level that seems rational in some way for the first two, the lowest and second quintile. It goes up a little bit. But when you get up in the higher levels, you see that the top 1% is just, it's just like off the charts almost. And so what we're trying to say is, it is not just about the 1%, it's about all of us. And how do we make this chart in the next 10, 25 years a little bit more even, where we see these lower levels growing at a higher, faster rate? People who are captains of industries are going to make a lot of money. A lot of these folks here are dot-com millionaires, people who kind of hit the jackpot and got rich. Those things are good for the country overall. But how do we create better paying jobs, higher levels of educated workforce, so that we could see these other quintiles increase at a much more rapid rate, so that we could have much more equity in the country? Long term, this is not sustainable. We can't have 1% of our economy over the next 50 years with these types of levels of income and the rest of it not, because it starts to impact us in ways that we just don't think about. For example, these folks in the lowest quintile aren't being able to actively participate in the economy. Their kids aren't being educated at the same level. They don't have access to childcare. They don't have access to a lot of things that will grow our economy over time. And the result of this is that we have 46 million people who are living in poverty. Now, I want to reiterate the point that it's about $23,000 for a family of four to be classified as poor in this country. Okay? That is a small amount of money, and it is the same level of dollars in every single state in this country. So if you live in Manhattan or New York City, where I grew up, you cannot survive on that kind of salary. In some other parts of the country, you might be able to actually, leverage family support and are able to survive. But in parts of this country, it's very difficult to survive on $22,000. And even when you double that to $40,000, $44,000, it's still very difficult in a lot of communities around the country. So we need to really kind of focus on what it really means in terms of real dollars, not just to talk about the poverty level. That's one of the things that we're trying desperately to use charts like this to kind of explain to folks what it means to be poor, not just to talk about the poverty line. Because I think people don't really understand the reality of what it is to be poor. And that caused some of the policymakers not to take action. There's a handout that I left on your table, and I will quickly run through some of this. These are some of the things that we're tracking. We've broken down the indicators into three main categories around creating jobs, strengthening families, and economic security. And what we're saying is that obviously unemployment is one of the major drivers in terms of the number of people who fall into poverty. In 2010, it was about 9.6. We've seen that starting to track down a little bit, and hopefully over the next year or two, we'll see that come down to a manageable level of around 5 or 6%. That alone will elevate the incomes of a lot of families, because they'll be back in the workforce, and obviously more jobs people are in, fewer of them will be in poverty. This issue around disconnected youth is more about future generations of people who are going to be poor, not just about people who are currently poor right now. And so disconnected youth are kids who are not working or in school. It has a tremendous impact on their long-term income growth. If you miss those years between 16 and 24, if you're not working or in an education institution, you're obviously not learning skills, you're not preparing yourself for future jobs, and you're basically going to be stuck in poverty for a long time. High school graduation is something that we definitely want to see drive up in terms of, again, preparing students for future jobs. Lack of health insurance is a big issue in terms of both keeping people out of work, but also the cost of getting sick and not being able to go to the doctor. Nationally, this number has been coming down, the number of children in foster care. And again, we picked this because foster care is a major driver for children who aren't prepared to go into the workforce at 18. Many kids in foster care are basically their relationship with the state ends, and then they're basically on their own, and they're not prepared for the workforce or prepared to go to school. So we want to see that number. Right now it's about 400,000 children who are in foster care. We want to see that number come down. It's been coming down over the last several years. It was about 430,000 in 2009, so that's been coming down. This next bullet here is something that we've crunched some new numbers to show the impact of dual earners in a family. One of the political issues that we wrestle with is that in DC you have conservatives who want to talk about marriage and the progressive people who want to talk about more supports for families. And we're saying we're trying to split the difference here and say we need to have more households with more than one earners in it. And how do we get to that point? It will be the policy issues that we'll be trying to drive, because it's very important in terms of the number of children who are in poverty if they're dual earners in the household. And these are just, this last one is the number of Americans who are unbanked, meaning that they don't have access to savings accounts and checking accounts. And I talked earlier about the cost of being poor. This is a major cost for families. They spend a lot of money cashing checks at local merchants and other places, and they don't have a relationship in terms of building long-term savings. And then finally in this category, the affordable housing bucket, low-income families in many communities across the country just cannot afford to can't find safe, affordable housing. For every 100 low-income residents across the country, there's only 62 affordable housing units. This is nationally. In many communities of the country, it's in the 30s. And so, in places like North and South Dakota, the numbers are skewed in the highway, so it kind of drive up the national average. But in New York and in Washington, D.C., it's in the 30s. And it's just a major burden for families because it's difficult to get into the workforce without affordable housing. Some key findings, and I won't go into too much of this. There's a handout with all of them, and I will go into the website in a quick minute to walk through some of these things. I mentioned this before, that since the 70s, wages have remained stagnant for most workers. It's even worse for lower wage workers. At the same time, we've seen the country advance significantly in terms of employee productivity. And this is, we have to figure out a way to create equity between employee productivity and wages in the country. Here we see the significant drop in terms of children in poverty when the mom is working full-time versus part-time, and that's an amazing fall in terms of the number of people who are in poverty. This is a terrible chart. I will go into it in a minute. Gotta have like super lens to see it, but I wanted to show it to you. This is your state, and these are all the indicators that we're tracking. And I'm going to show it to you in a second on the actual website to show you how you can manipulate the data and then open it up for questions. And here are some specific things that we're hoping that this report will help people do. When Brett first talked to me, he's like, we have to figure out how to compare our states, show folks how to compare our states to other states. And I'm like, which state do you want me to compare? And he gave me a long list, so I figured I'll just actually do it here instead of trying to come up with charts like that no one can see. So we want to help folks develop advocacy campaigns and figure out how to engage the media, work with business partners, and figure out how to make business partners understand that if you have pay equity between men and women in your state, how that will help drive the economy in the state. If you increase the high school graduation rate in your state, how that will help prepare workers for the future. Those types of things that are away from a poverty kind of conversation and more about economic development and growing the economy in a much more equitable way. Those are the kind of framing that we're trying to do right now, because we know that when you start talking about cutting poverty, there's a good segment of people who are going to be with you, and then there's some folks who are going to say, well, the poor people, they live over there, and I don't need to worry about them. You know, it's not an issue for me. Well, it is an issue for everyone. We have a stat out that it costs the country $500 billion annually because the poverty rate is so high. So, you know, if we were to reduce that number, we would have, you know, $250, $300 billion that we could reinvest in the economy, and we'd all grow together if we bring down the poverty rate. And the cost is from things like incarceration, healthcare costs, and one that we don't really think about is the lack of productivity from a large segment of our population. So we can do it. We're hoping that these tools will help us in local communities figure out much more innovative and efficient ways to drive the policy agenda. And let me now show you some of the tools that we have to help you do that. So this is the website. When you come onto the website, you'll see that you have like the top level numbers that and this number will change every time you come. These numbers will change every time you come onto the website. So it's just to give you a big kind of scan of the country. Up on the top right, we have resources. You could download the paper on the publications, and on the data, you can go in and play around with your state. All right, so one of the cool things that we did here is that we tried to figure out a way to give advocates some idea of where their state is located in terms of a rank with the other states, or what are the three things that are most in need of improvement. And so for Arkansas, we have the number of 25 to 34-year-olds who are with associates or higher degrees. And in that category, you guys are in the bottom. This one really surprised me. The food insecurity is defined as the number of families in a year who don't have enough food for members of their household throughout the year. So at some point during the year, there were some family members who had to go hungry and didn't have access to nutrition. And again, in this category, you guys are in the bottom, and I was actually very surprised by that particular indicator. One that jumped out that I wouldn't have expected for Arkansas. Teen birth rate is another one that you guys are pretty low in terms of the country. And we think that improvements in all of these things over the next couple of years will improve the number, reduce the number of people who are in poverty. And let me explain why. Teen birth rates, for example, is something that impacts a teenager who has a child in the 15 to 19 year range has a much lower chance of finishing college, finishing high school, going into the labor market. Many of them become disconnected from education, and there's also a likelihood that they will end up on some federal programs in terms of assistance. So if you could bring down the rates of young ladies who are having babies in their teen years, over time, we create much more opportunities for those young people. And this is one of the reasons why we're tracking this. We are looking at both prevention in terms of our indicators, but also aggressively trying to help the people who are currently poor, but prevent other people from falling into poverty. If we do both of those things, we could bring the numbers down faster, as opposed to just helping the people who are now poor. So as you can see, for the poverty rate, 15.1% is what the national poverty rate is. Arkansas is 18%, so the red line on the right is where the state is for all of these things. Food insecurity, again, you guys are in the outlier sections. But here is an interesting thing. Arkansas is doing really well in terms of its unemployment rate. So one would say, I started out saying that unemployment is like one of the highest things, and then the data contradicts what I'm saying. But the important point here is that all of these things are connected. It's a very, very complex intermingling set of policies that we are all trying to drive. And so some folks in the state will say, well, our unemployment numbers are low. We shouldn't worry about unemployment. And I would say that's not a good way to go. We want to see that move to the left. Unemployment is low in the state, but then you look at the wage gap in the state. And again, the state is not doing very well in this category. So even though there are a lot more people working in Arkansas than the national average, a lot more women are now in the workforce, and their pay between men and women is not equal in the state. And in fact, you guys are towards the worst section of the country in terms of that. So how do we equalize the pay for all those new moms that are now in the workforce so that they can earn the same amount of money as men in the workforce? I think that's something that will help drive down the number of children who live in poverty. If more moms are working and they're not making the same amount of money as men, if you equalize that, more income comes into the family, more dual incomes come into the family, and we see a much lower rate of poverty. All right. So again, this just kind of, you can play around with this. It goes through all the different states, and it shows you where your state is compared to everyone else. We list these things based on good jobs, family economic security, and strengthening families. I want to show you one cool thing real quick. Let me go back up here. So if you can imagine, part of the process over the last 9 months was to try and bring this down to a manageable level of things that we wanted to look at. We started out with about 100 indicators that we were looking at, and over the last several months, we've fine-tuned to this level here, where we only have 25, and 25 is a lot. But we feel that the challenge of reducing poverty is a complex, kind of level things that we need to look at a number of different categories to help people think through, one, areas that they're interested in and how those things might also interact with other poverty issues that they don't pay attention to, because you might be someone who's focusing on education, but you're not focusing on unemployment. You might be someone who's focusing on childcare, but you're not focusing on teen parenting. And we want to say, we must all figure out how to work and support our fellow advocates in communities to drive a larger policy agenda. Even if you're not focusing on one specific area of this, you should be aware of it and figure out how those things impact your particular issue that you're concerned with. I don't think that anyone in this room is going to work in all 25, but if you pick 3 things that you want to drive aggressively and figure out how to get your policymakers to really make progress on these areas, I think that will be a useful kind of advocacy approach in your community. So finally, this is a way to kind of gauge your state in comparison to other states that are close to you or just nationally, and you could rank your state. Here it shows you, like, if you click on, let me just do it. In each of these categories, and this is in high school graduation, you could come on here and you could click on it, and it'll show you the state that's doing, the best in the country and the worst in the country. So you could do that for each category to get a sense as to where your state is located on these particular issues. This is a cool feature because it allows you to say, how's Texas doing on this particular thing if you're going to meet with a state rep or a member of Congress. And you could come on here and you could print this out and you could show, these are the reasons why we are pushing for this particular change. These are the reasons why we think you ought to make investments in these particular programs, because this national database is showing that we are, 45th out of 51. DC's classified as a state in our analysis, by the way, but we're 40 whatever. These are the reasons why we need to make improvements, and this is a useful tool to do that. It's a really cool website. There's so much that's in it that it would take me an hour to kind of show you all of it. My recommendation would be to go on the website, play around with it, see all the different nooks and crannies that you can get from it, and see how it might be useful in your work. So again, we see that number 1 in the country here in high school graduation is Wisconsin. Arkansas is right there. Let me just show you some additional resources. We have state-by-state fact sheets. So we have the paper obviously up there, and then we have the summary that you have on your table. And then we have state-by-state fact sheets, so you could come and click on your state. If you're going to a quick meeting and you don't have time to play around with the database, we're trying to do it for you, so you don't have to spend a lot of time. And we give like a quick profile of the state, talk about how it's doing in terms of creating good jobs, what it's ranked. And you could just print this out and take it with you to a meeting to kind of, drive whatever particular issues you're trying to drive. So that's something that we find fairly useful for people. I want to open it up for questions to see if folks have any questions before I continue to chat on here. Yes, ma'am.
1 second. Let's get a microphone to you.
One of your slides showed the possibility of engaging media and business.
Mm-hmm.
Are there places where public-private partnerships have
Fantastic question. So one of the things that we're working on right now is an action toolkit that we will have up on the site on November 9th. We're having a national webinar with some policymakers. We're going to walk through this in a national webinar, and we're putting up a big toolkit that will have a lot of different types of tools that will help people to figure out how to work with different partners. The business community is a partner that we're trying to engage. How you can create public-private partnerships, how you can work with the philanthropic community, how you can engage different ethnic groups, because there's a lot of rich data in the paper that talks about inequality, not just in terms of the income gap that I showed, but also among different racial groups. So that will be out on the 9th, and it'll be on the site. Yeah, we highlight in the paper a couple partnerships that are innovative partnerships that are focusing on employment for low-income workers. One in, I think, Massachusetts that's looking at healthcare workers and how we prepare disconnected youth to be in the healthcare field. This is a growing sector of our economy, one of the few growing sectors, and so we want to make sure that low-income people aren't left out as that sector continues to grow. We also talk about a partnership between a foundation and some workforce development partners. I think it's in Pittsburgh in the paper. And these types of things will be on the website in the toolkit as well.
Yes, ma'am.
Enjoyed your presentation. There are a number of ways, I think, to measure all the kinds of indicators that you indicate here. There's numerous different ways to measure poverty or unemployment, just from the federal government, let alone other resources. How did you all decide on what measures to use, and what implications do those decisions have for how you reach your goals of cutting those measures in half over the next 10 years?
So we started out with the framework idea of focusing on jobs, strong families, and economic stability. So that's the process that when I came in on this project, they said, these are the three things that you can't change. And so that being said, I decided to look around at what other UN development goals, they have a similar type of project. And, just being in Washington, D.C., frankly, part of this, kind of falls into the political landscape of what you're trying to do. Things that are going to be constant over the next 10 years came into play. And then things that we know that the data shows are very impactful in terms of creating long-term economic opportunity for people. We focus on some of those things. So, for example, high school graduation is one thing that we wanted to make sure was in a bucket somewhere, because we know that people who graduate from high school obviously go on to college at a higher rate, and if you go on to college in the current economy, you tend to do better and your income grows over time. But we also want to look at, like things that are impacting poor people right now. And one of those things would be unemployment, and how do we drive down the unemployment rate so that as you drive down the unemployment rate, we saw this in the recession. 9 million new people came into poverty because of jumping from a 6% to a 9.6% unemployment. So all of those things kind of factor into it, and we had to, play around with it to figure out which bucket things would fit into. One thing that's new in here is the unbanked. That's something that poverty advocates tend not to talk about a lot, like the asset building component of things. But we know that just not having a bank account has a lot of negative consequences in families in terms of robbing them of resources. You know, you can pay $300 to get your tax done, get your taxes done each year, as opposed to $7 are free at a Vita site. And so how do we figure out a way to engage more people so that they don't go to one of the higher cost places and get their money in the same time? One of the reasons why people don't go to a Vita site is because they don't have an account. And so when they go to one of the paid preparers, they can actually walk out with a credit card, which is a credit card, after leaving $300 of their $3,500 EITC check, which is a huge percentage of it. And that alone is keeping people in poverty.
Done. Gene.
Thank you. You know, it was probably 1968 when we had the last presidential candidate who passionately, powerfully, and in deep, informed ways talked about eradicating poverty. And I sort of think sometimes that Bobby Kennedy is spinning in his grave as we think about and reflect on our national discourse. But there's one piece of this that I talked last week with a friend of a former staffer of Bobby Kennedy's, and he was talking about how the senator worked hard to not only understand the issues of poverty, but then after that he talked about creating new images of possibility and hope, that is to say, solutions. As we look at issues of, like, for example, let's take one. So what I'm arguing here and asking about is how do we, data is sort of like a lamppost for a drunk, right? It's oftentimes better for support than illumination, right?
I'm going to use that, by the way. That's
and I'm moved by this data, but I look at one of these, for example, high school graduation and the connected issue of disconnected youth. Mm-hmm. There's another piece of this that we're completely silent about, and that is that high schools, the education of adolescents in our culture, is the goofiest, stupidest thing that we do in a lot of ways. And yet our response, let's get tougher. Let's exacerbate these issues of disconnection with our cultural obsession and fetish with testing, which is really an exclusionary pedagogical practice. We have an administration that's actually building, frankly, a program that still rests on these. Linda McNeil, a researcher at Rice University, actually is arguing that what we're asking kids to do in high school may be the exact opposite that's preparing kids for a modern world. So I love this data. We need to engage in this data, but what I'm concerned about is how we also, from it, create new kinds of images of hope and possibility that respond. High schools that are relevant, students that are deeply engaged rather than test to death. So how do we create from this data, in the spirit and hope of Bobby Kennedy, new images of hope and possibility?
Wow, that's a big question. That question is almost as large as this report. But I'm going to try and break it into a couple of pieces. So one of the things that we were trying to do with this document is to say that, I've been working on this for, a couple of years, these types of issues. And when I talk to people, when I talk to my parents, for example, and I say, I work on poverty issues, and they say, good luck, and these are the people who instilled my kind of moral background, and they're still saying, good luck, all right, and I say, what about, my mom's a nurse, and I say to her, what if we were to figure out a way to, identify more young women who grew up in the communities that I grew up in to be nurses? You're getting ready to retire, who's going to replace you? What if we figure out a program to make sure that much more of the young women who live in Queens, where I grew up, are now going to be in the nursing field? Oh, no, that's a great idea. You should work on that, Desmond. So I think this is your question is a very good question. It's a big question, but it's a very good question. We have to break this stuff down into smaller pieces, and that's what we're trying to do. One of the unfortunate things about DC is that data is important to drive the policy discourse. And one of the things that I'm passionate about is early learning, okay? How do we create the environment to prepare our students so that if they decide not to go on to college, they have the strong enough early years from, child care all the way through to high school, so that they're prepared to leave high school and go out into the workforce and be able to find a job. Right now with, if you want to work at Taco Bell, you have to learn how to use a computer. Okay, and there are kids who are graduating from high school, in some parts of this country who just don't have access to computers. And we need to figure out how to create that environment where we can prepare all students in a certain basic way so that they have a certain level of tools to go out into the workforce and be able to find jobs. The second piece of this, one data point that I didn't put up here because there's just too many, is the investment in workforce and training for post-high school years. It's gone down as a percentage of the GDP by half since the 70s. So we're de-investing in training for people after high school in this country, which is something that we can't do. The old model is that you get out of high school, you go to college, you get a job, and you go buy a house. And we're seeing a lot of problems with that old model now, and so we have to figure out ways to improve training for people, what I call lifelong training opportunities, right? So it starts from childcare all the way through to high school, all the way after high school or college if you decide to go to college. But if you're not going to college, how can you get training throughout the course of your life so that you can continue to upgrade your skills? Kind of what they call professional training in a lot of fields. Well, plumbers should have professional training also. Electricians should have professional training. Whatever fields you're in, you should have professional training and grow with the economy because it's constantly changing. And what we're seeing in places like Detroit and Youngstown, Ohio, and Albany, New York, and maybe here in Little Rock, I don't know the data that specifically here, is that we have a group of workers who industries have left them and they're not being able to find the training fast enough to get into the new industries that are coming into the community. And that is a problem for the country. And so it's a backwards way. It's what they call pivoting from your question. I'm not answering your question directly because it's too big and I don't have enough time. But those are two specific things that I think we ought to do. Investment in early learning, investment in lifelong training opportunities for people, and reinvesting in education and training opportunities for people who might not be going to college. Because everyone is not going to go to college. I mean, it's just not, it's expensive and so on.
In Arkansas, one thing, I'm involved in an area that we're taking one piece of this with the No Kid Hungry campaign. And we have partners that are businesses, partners that are foundations, state agencies, and we're just focusing on how we can make sure the kids get the food they need. Arkansas was #1 in child hunger. We were also at the same time #7 in childhood obesity. And so we're looking at those issues and how to make sure children have access to those programs that are already out there and are already funded. And so maybe what I'm hearing you suggest, look at a few of these and see what we can do on that same kind, in that same kind of way, bringing all the partners to the table to concentrate on some of these other areas.
Right. I mean, I think, we picked the 3 bottom because it was just an easy way to kind of show where your state is in our measures. But if folks are already working on hunger issues in the state, whatever the issue is that you're passionate about, we want to create the tools to help you to drive that agenda. And I think one thing that I've been getting a lot of media attention from is, reporters want to know, why is my state 49 or 50th or whatever in this particular issue? And if you have relationships with media contacts, and there's an issue that you continue to work on, you might want to reach out to them and say, there's this new report out that shows that, Arkansas is last in food insecurity. And then have a conversation around the fact that there are a lot of hungry kids in the state, but there's also a lot of obese kids in the state. People look at obesity rates and they say, well, hungry people aren't obese. And it's just like one of the most ridiculous things that people always say, why do we have such a large segment of our population that's overweight if there's such high food insecurity in the country? And those two things in many cases are driving each other. People, people can't afford to pay for the higher nutrition valued food, so they try to satisfy their hunger by eating things that are high in carbs and blah, 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 blah. So I think that you ought to use this data to figure out how to engage new partners and how to drive your agenda. And we are more than happy to help.
And we just celebrated 1 year and made huge progress, just because all these people are working together.
Right. So I would love to come back next year when, Arkansas is no longer, in the same boat that it is in now and say, we were helpful in driving a policy agenda to attack these things. You know, maybe Texas might be the last state in teen pregnancy, or you know, whatever. I think that's what we're trying to do, is to create some kind of competition, you know, in terms of states moving in the right direction. Obviously, somebody's going to be in the last slot, but it doesn't have to be you. So that's what we're trying to do. Yes, ma'am.
Last one.
I'm just curious if you have relationships with other national initiatives that their objectives and data would align carefully with. I am a consultant with the National Alliance of Children's Trust and Prevention Funds, and we have just begun an initiative to prevent child neglect. And the early analysis of our literature review is telling us about a very strong connection between poverty and child neglect.
Right.
And
well, you know, this paper just came out last week, and we are right now expanding our partnership opportunities with different organizations, both in DC and around the country. You know, I'm on a roadshow with the document, trying to build a larger coalition of advocates and people who are interested in working with us. There is something in this document for almost every segment of the human needs community. To the issue of child neglect, the number of kids who fall into foster care, child neglect is a major driver of that. And so if we could drive down the number of children who are being abused and neglected by their families, we see the number of children in foster care come down, and we know the long-term consequences of time in foster care. So we were trying to figure out how to attack these issues from a whole bunch of different places, so we could pull in people who are only interested in one piece of it and engage them where they are into this larger issue of driving this policy agenda. For example, if you have strong relationships with a member of, you know, a particular committee that we are trying to get to in Congress, you know, we'd love to call you and work with you to figure out how you could get in there and help us to drive this idea of what do we need to do to reduce the number of kids who increase the number of kids who transition from foster care into safe living environments and families that, you know, help them be more successful.
Jeannie?
one of the challenges with, when you first introduced yourself at the beginning, where you said that you wanted to break the complex issue down so that it didn't feel as if it were something impossible to have an impact upon. Of course, the issue of child neglect is also a very complex issue. And so immediately, you know, I look to your messaging helps that you have with your toolkit. It seems like a very important piece to communicate that there are things that people can do and that it's not an impossibility to have an impact.
Right. The communication people tell me not to use the word complex. So I'm going to have to put $1 in the jar when I get back, because that was not supposed to come out today. This is, it's very, you know, it's, I don't know what a word to use other than complex, but it's an issue that we can change, because each of these sections of this document is actionable and we can make changes on all of them. We have in the past made changes in all of them. We just have to figure out how to take back the agenda and present it in a way that policymakers realize that if we don't make these changes now, the U.S. will suffer in the long term. We talk extensively in the paper about U.S. long-term competitiveness in these other growing economies around the country. For the longest time, we were the country where everyone wanted to come to and everyone wanted to live, and as a result, we were doing a brain drain from around the globe. Now we have people who are moving back to their home countries, are not coming here in the same numbers, and so we are going to have a talent problem if we don't figure out how to educate the young people who are being born in this country to prepare them for the future workforce. And I say this to, you know, people who are approaching their retirement age and people who are in the middle of their careers. You know, for those who are approaching their retirement age, you know, we ought to make sure that we understand and make policymakers understand that this is a comfort issue for you. If you don't have people who are going to be prepared to take care of you as you live longer and age in place and all of those things, it creates a comfort issue. For people who are in the middle of their careers, if we don't have a workforce that's going to keep the country vibrant and competitive, your long-term productivity in your jobs is probably going to be lower. So this is not about poor people, and it's not about the 1%. It's not about the, it's not about the 99%. It's about the 100% of this country that if we don't fix these issues in the near term, we're going to have some serious problems going forward. And we want to help people to find the tools to engage their members of Congress and their policymakers at the local level to make them understand the urgency that we're talking about. Right now, we're looking at a situation where they're looking to cut childcare, they're looking to cut workforce development, they're looking to cut a lot of these programs that are direct investments into the future of our country. And we want to see the deficit controlled, but we also want to see a country that's vibrant and competitive in the future so that I can retire and be comfortable. So that's my spiel.
Well, thank you, Desmond, for the spiel.